Okay, recording in progress. So if you have the sheet, take it out. Otherwise, you can open up your Chumash to chapter 11. And so what I thought I would try to do with you this evening, as best I can, is try to understand what's really a bit of a mysterious episode. The story of the Tower of Babel, which is often referred to as Dor Haflaga, the generation of the dispersion. When you look at the psukim, that I have on the page, that I have, really it goes on for a couple of more psukim, but this is the gist of it. And it says, "Vayehi kol haaretz safa achat u'devar achadim," that the whole world was just one language and uniform. Achadim, few. In other words, the number of words in the vocabulary, and it seems like the topics that they discussed were very, very limited. Okay, and it came to pass when they traveled from the east. The word east in Hebrew, of course, there are two different words in Hebrew for east. One is Mizrach, which is based upon Zricha, the sun rising, the glow of the sun, where the sun first rises, which is also the east. And the other one is Kedem, because things begin in the east and they move towards the west. So we think of the beginnings. So when it says that they traveled from the east, and the Hebrew word is Kedem, you could translate it, they traveled from earlier times. They were traveling from earlier experiences. Doesn't have to be specifically east, but we assume it is. Throughout most of human history, or the history of civilization, civilization has moved from east to west, right? So that's, and they came to a valley named Shinar. Now what we call Shinar is Babylonia. This is, or in Greek, Mesopotamia. This is the land between the rivers, and it's today Iraq, which was one of the cradles of human civilization. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." We're going to talk about that phrase. And the bricks were like stones, and the clay was then for mortar. Notice they didn't have big building rocks. Like here in Yerushalayim, major building is done with rock. And that was true in Egypt as well. But in Mesopotamia, they don't have this storehouse of quarries that they can cut out big rocks. So they made bricks, mud bricks. And then it says, which is perhaps the most important verse, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens." So whatever it was that they did wrong, it sounds like it's somehow contained in this pasuk. "And let us make ourselves a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of the entire earth." So at this point, I'm not sure what's really going on, but it seems like this pasuk has the difficult material in it. Building a city to heaven, making a name for themselves, and trying to remain concentrated in one place rather than spreading over the face of the earth. All that's in verse 4. Verse 5, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, comes down and saw what was going on. And Hashem, verse 6 says, yeah, they're one people. They've got this unity, which is a good thing. They have all one language. They can communicate with one another. And this is what they do. So in other words, somehow God saw something negative. Now, will it not be withheld from them for what they're planning to do? They're trying to do something. Should I stop them? And the answer is going to be yes. Come, let us descend and confuse the language to prevent them from carrying out their scheme, whatever that scheme might be. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, mivalbel, bavel, mixes up, there makes a bilbul, makes a confusion out of their speech. Okay. And then it says Hashem scattered them upon the face of the entire and they ceased building the city. So we're not sure what's going on here. Kadosh Baruch Hu sees this, what's going on, doesn't like it, and disperses them. So we're going to see a number of approaches to try to understand what was it that that this conglomeration of peoples did. And I'm going to start with the truth is I could start with a number of them. We're going to start with the Netziv. The Netziv, who is Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, and we've mentioned him many times before. He was the famous Rosh Yeshiva of the great Lithuanian yeshiva Volozhin. Today, Volozhin is in Belarus, but that area of the then Russian Empire was Tsarist Russia, was considered Lithuania. And he was not only a great Rosh Yeshiva, he was also a great scholar and a writer, and he had, two famous sons. One son was Chaim Berlin, famous yeshiva in Brooklyn named after him on Coney Island Avenue. And another son changed his last name from Berlin to Bar Ilan. His second son was Meir, his younger son Meir. And so that, of course, he comes to Eretz Yisrael, and Bar Ilan University is named for his other son, Reb Meir Berlin. Okay, so he said one language. So in other words, the lack of diversity in expression, in other words, speech becomes the source of the sin. Okay, that's what caused the first sin amongst this group. Not the first sin of humanity, the first sin of this group. This is that they agreed to stop in one single place. And that's against the will of God. And the will of God said to them, fill the land and replenish. Peru uravu umil et haaretz. Be fruitful, multiply, and spread out. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted humanity to spread out and take over all of planet Earth, as we have indeed done. But this group was the family of Noah. This is almost all, if not all, of humanity. They didn't want to separate. They wanted to stay together, and that was against the will of God. So the Netziv has a very simple explanation for what the sin was. Okay. As to walk to all places, since the land was created to be settled, and the same words, the text did not explain what these words were. Rather, hi. We're welcoming everybody. Okay. Rather, it leaves the hint to explain the midrash, but the words themselves are not explained by the text. In other words, it only had a few words, but what the words were, we don't know. In other words, it wasn't the fact that there were just a few words. It was the fact that the number of words was limited and their focus remained limited. Humanity is supposed to expand. Vocabulary, geography, minds was supposed to be expansive. Okay, over the Chagim, we expanded our waists as well. I can't speak for you, but for me. Okay. But the words themselves are not, the Torah doesn't tell us what the words are. It just says that they were the same words to teach us that it wasn't because of the content of the words themselves that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the Holy One, blessed be He, was distressed. They were what they were, and in its simplicity there's not sin. On the contrary, all appears well. But here is what happened, is that all thought the same thing, and this came to be the problem of the settlement. That was the problem, that the few words fed into what ultimately becomes the sin, which is staying concentrated in one location. Now, there's one other point that he makes that's just fascinating, even though it's not what I really want to discuss so much tonight. So I'm going to just do this quickly. At the end of the Netziv, he was concerned with the fact that they made bricks and they burned them through thoroughly, okay? That they spent nisrafa l'sreifa. They spent a lot of effort making these bricks very, very hard. I've never been to Baghdad, where Bavel, the city of Babylon, was. But in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, they have a reconstruction of the famous blue tile gate of Babel. It's beautiful. It's made with these blue tile bricks. And then in it, there were like lions and other, majestic beasts. But they're very proud of the bricks. That was like a big deal. They made these beautiful bricks. But the Netziv says there was more to it than artistry. Burn them thoroughly. There is no place in the Torah where something is told that has no impact. If the Torah gave us a detail about these bricks, that they were burnt and fired very strongly, there must be something in the story. But from here we have a hint to the issue of what obviously was happening before the tradition, saying that they threw Avram Avinu into the fiery furnace. They made these furnaces to make the bricks. However, once you've already got the furnace, there are other things you can do with that furnace. And in this case, they threw Avram Avinu into the furnace because of his newfangled ideas of monotheism. They did not make the furnace for the need of bricks. Rather, this was the fiery furnace made for the need of burning people. So the original purpose of these terrible ovens was to destroy people. Of course, the Netziv is writing this before the Holocaust, but for us, this vision is just horrendous. And so they had these fiery furnaces, and they eventually used them to make the bricks, but they had a nefarious purpose initially. Okay, but that's a side issue. I'm more concerned. So we've got one definition of the sin, which was they refused to follow God's instruction to spread out and inhabit all of planet Earth. Okay, so we're going to take a look now at a much earlier commentary from the 13th century. Reb David Kimchi, a very famous rabbinic family, and there's still Kimchis today that descend from them, a very famous Sephardic family. And so it says, okay, utuvarim achadim, and they were of one mind. Something else is bothering the Radak. It's not the word so much, it's the mindset. Okay? And then he says that our posik, in talking about it, mentions their peh, their mouths, okay? And he says, there's an expression in Hebrew, which is the mouth is the organ used to verbalize thoughts in one's mind. It's also used elsewhere to describe unanimity. When a meeting decides an issue unanimously, it's called peh echad. Hichlitu, hiskimu, peh echad. That's something that Israelis aren't used to hearing about. Unanimity is something that isn't very common here in the Holy Land, but the concept exists. Okay, so everybody, so he's focusing on the fact that they were somehow getting rid of all dissent. We're going to come back. We're not done with this idea. This occurred approximately, this whole story occurs according to, now I have to be honest, I was a history major. So what I'm going to say right now doesn't necessarily correspond to what a more traditional historical approaches to trying to understand the chronology of Tanakh. But be this as it may, this is the rabbinic chronology based upon adding up all of the years of the lives of the individuals in the chronologies, in those genealogies that are listed in chapter 5 is the chronology or the genealogy from Adam Arishon, from Adam until Noah. And then in chapter 10, we just before this story, we had the chronology from Noah that brings us all the way up to Avram Avinu, although it gets finished right after the story here in chapter 11. So when you add up the years when people were born and when people died, we see that this was 340 years after the flood, after the Mabul. It appears that Noah and his son, as well as Aver, Shem and Aver, those two great scholars who were teachers of the patriarchs of Avram and of Yaakov. We don't know if they ever interacted with Yitzchak, but tradition claims that they did interact with Avram and with Yaakov. So Shem and Aver and Noach were alive. Noach was approximately 900 years old at the time of the flood. I'm sorry, he was 600 years old at the time of the flood. Now he's about 950 years old, and he lives to be 950. So he was alive at this period, but died just about a decade later. They weren't part of this consensus. So we see that they all agreed, but Noach wouldn't agree, Shem wouldn't agree, Ava wouldn't agree. What's going on here? As they were smart enough and righteous enough to understand what this might lead to, that this unanimity is a very bad thing. Avram was already 45 years old at the time of the incident of the tower. According to some scholars, he was either 45 or 48 or 40. Different opinions given when he became aware of God. So when did he become a monotheist? So some people say in his 40s. However, other sages credit Avram with gaining such knowledge already at the tender age of 3. What can I say? Did Avram Avinu become a monotheist philosophically at the age of 3? That sounds like an art scroll biology. That you've got some Torah giant who was born already a Torah giant. There were stories about Gedolim that said brachot while nursing. I take these stories with a grain of salt, to say the least. But there is an opinion in the Midrash that he found God at the age of 3. The Rambam, in the beginning of Hilchot Avodah Zarah, sort of solves the problem by saying he began searching when he was 3, but only found satisfactory answers when he reached the age of 40, which is considered, according to the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, is the time of Binah, of understanding. We know there are customs in certain communities. It's not a halachas, it's a minhag, that started sometimes after the time of Shabtai Tzvi, that people shouldn't study Kabbalah until they're 40 years old, because 40 is the time of Binah. The 5th parak in Pirkei Avot teaches us. But based upon that, the Rambam says, he started searching when he was 3, but he only came up with satisfactory philosophic responses to his questions when he was 40. And he sort of like solves both sides of the issue. Just an editorial comment. Judaism would be in big trouble if nobody studied Kabbalah until they were 40, since Rabbi Nachman died when he was 38 and was a great Kabbalist, and the Arizal, who was the father of modern Kabbalah, and perhaps even a reincarnation of the Rashbi, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, he died at 36. So if people really didn't study, Kabbalah until they were 40, the world would be a much poorer place. But okay, let's get back to the Radak. At any rate, Noah and his family convinced that God had created the universe for no other purpose than to settle all or most of it. This sounds like the Netziv. However, although they knew all this, they decided to go along with the majority opinion at that time, and to preserve the positive values of unity and a common language among all men. According to Breshit Rabbah, the plan to congregate and build the tower was already idolatrous. In other words, it's already a form of avodah zarah, to go against Hashem's will. It's already a type of idolatry. Their argument being that God cannot lay claim to the heaven, to assign only earth as the domain of man. They wanted to assert their independence from God's control of their fates. So in other words, really, when they said we're going to stay together and we're going to make sure that there is no disagreement, that everyone has to be on the same page all the time, all of this was just a horrible forerunner to what becomes idolatry, which idolatry is really negating the will of Hashem. They're taking whatever it is Hashem that wants from us and saying, no, we're doing something else. We have a better plan because we don't want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to in any way have any control over us. There's a problem. There's a problem that sometimes happens with a majority that the will of majority is a wonderful democratic idea, but there can also be a tyranny of a majority where they wipe out minority opinions. And that's a real problem. If you could look at the bottom of the back page for just a minute, there's like a little footnote, a little story at the end. Before we go through a couple of other opinions, there's a story told about Reb Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk, Reb Chaim Brisk, who died in 1918. And he chose not to join the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah. Now, Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah was something that was invented in 1912 at an Aguda convention in Katowice, which is also then in the Russian Empire. Later was in Poland. And they decided that they were going to have two committees. They were going to have a committee of rabbis called Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah, and then Balabatim, which was going to be the regular Aguda meeting. So the rabbis and the Balabatim would meet separately, and Reb Chaim went to the first meeting of the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah, but he, as time went on, I don't know how long it took, but he stopped communicating with the group. Why? Why did he want to remain separate from this prestigious group of rabbis? Asked why he made this decision, he replied, "Let me tell you why. When they introduced electricity into Brisk, it was amazing." Now, electricity came to Brisk sometime in the 1890s. We could do away with the lamps, which were messy and costly, and our entire town is now lit by cheap, clean electricity. There was only one problem. In the past, when one person's lamp went out, the others remained lit, and there was light throughout the rest of Brisk. Now, however, when the generator goes out, the entire town is cast into darkness. In other words, all of us being in the same situation is not always good for the community. It's good to have other opinions and other situations and other sources of light or sources of power. And he felt like, let's spread the different opinions. And quite often, Reb Chaim did disagree with the majority of rabbis in the community. He quite often did go off on his own, and the rest of the Soloveitchik family has quite often followed in that tradition. But he felt, excuse me, sorry, he felt that was excellent for Klal Yisrael, that was to the benefit of Klal Yisrael. I didn't put this on the sheet. There was an essay written by Professor Shalom Rosenberg. Professor Rosenberg was a wonderful man. He's approaching 90 now. I've had the privilege of meeting him both socially and taking classes with him. He was head of the philosophy department at the Hebrew University for many years. He continues to teach at Herzog, and you can still take courses. I think some of his classes are online now as a result of COVID. And he commented on the generation of the flood. I'm sorry, of the tower, and he said and I'm having trouble finding. Just give me a second. The generation of this dispersion gave expression to an ideal that had beautiful elements, Chazal compared the generation of the flood, who were immersed in theft, to the generation of dispersion, who loved each other. So in other words, when you compare these guys to the generation of the flood, these guys look like tzaddikim. And most of all because they did have this unity. They loved each other and at least proclaimed their love for each other. The vision of the modern generation of the dispersion presented a difficult challenge to religious belief. In other words, it seems like it should be good. The collapse of the modern generation of dispersion that is unfolding before our eyes teaches us about the true nature from the very beginning. And he is specifically talking about the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. As a philosopher, he fought tooth and nail in the 50s, 60s, and 70s against other philosophers who believed that communism was the way for the future. And Dr. Rosenberg, Professor Rosenberg, always disagreed. And he said that they are really a tyranny of the commune, and that individual thinking is destroyed, and so is belief in God. That the community becomes the idolatry of the country, and that's a terrible thing. That in the world where the country, the community, the commune is everything, there's no place for God. And this bothered Professor Rosenberg very, very much. And he was very anti-communist and celebrated greatly. This essay was written in the 90s. He celebrated greatly the fall of communism. Okay, let's try to get into two more opinions before I hope there's time to explore one other idea later tonight. Okay, the Rabbeinu Bechaye. So Rabbeinu Bechaye died in 1340 and viewed himself as a student of the Ramban. And he's going to say two different ideas that I think are fascinating. From a homiletical point of view, the operative clause in our verses about the sin are the words, let us make a name for ourselves. This is an oblique reference to idolatry. When someone has that ga'ava, that haughtiness, that vanity to say it's all about me, there's no place for God in that person's life. So it already smacks of idolatry. The word shem, name here, and the same word in Shmot, when it talks about idolatry, v'shem elokim acherim lo tizkuru, and the name of other gods don't mention, and that's in Parshas Mishpatim, and you must not mention the name of any other god, mean the same thing. So in other words, the fact that they said, let's give ourselves a name, let's make ourselves gods, that was the sin according to Rabbeinu Bechaye. Before we go on, I just want to point out two things. Number one, and this is from Elchanan's Rabbi Elchanan Samet, who's a Rebbe at Yeshivat Har Etzion and writes great essays on different topics in Tanakh, especially on Tehillim. And this whole business, and we shall make a name for ourselves, is the essence of their pretension. In the dedications of various kings discovered in the excavations in Mesopotamia, we repeatedly find the claim that their towers will reach heaven. Now, we know that the flat plains of Shinar, that we call Mesopotamia, Iraq, was dotted with these ziggurats in the ancient world, with these multi-tiered pyramids. They sort of look, if you know anything about Mexican, Central American history, the Mayans, the Aztecs built these kind of stepped pyramids as well. But in that area of the world, they were called ziggurats. And some of the bricks in them, the foundations of the ziggurats were sunk deep into the ground. We repeatedly find the claim that these towers reach heaven. These dedications claim many times that the kings who built or restored these towers made a name, shame, reputation for them in their kingdoms, even to the extent of earning them a place amongst the gods. Now, just before we go on, there's a poem that I like very much, and I'm going to for a second diminish the screen. I don't know if you'll still see me for a minute, but okay. And it's a poem written by Shelley, and this poem written by Shelley is called Ozymandias, and it's a sonnet. And in the sonnet, he says, "I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 'Two vast trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on those lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Now, this poem was written in 1817 when many archaeological finds were being discovered in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and some were being brought back to Britain. And he wrote this poem while a massive statue of Ramses II, who was probably the pharaoh of the Exodus, was being brought to the British Museum. It hadn't arrived yet when he wrote the poem, but the poem was read when it was unveiled. And again, we're making a name for ourselves, and that was an attitude of certain ancient kings who considered themselves to be, deities. And so the making of the name for themselves was, according to Rabbeinu Bechaye, and when you read some of these accounts brought down by Rabbi Samet and the great poem by Shelley, it was a problem. It was a problem that these builders, great builders, really viewed themselves that way. There are historians that believe that the greatest builder in the history of mankind was Ramses II. So our ancestors, they didn't build the pyramids, but they were part of some of the most massive governmental building projects ever conceived. Okay, let's go back to Rabbeinu Bechaye. I'm just above the line, the sentence which is bolded. The word hava introduces an evil thought. When our pasuk said, "Hava, let's go build a terrible, this tower up to heaven, this terrible thing." Okay, hava nitachak malah was what Pharaoh Ramses II, Ozymandias, said about the Jews. Let's deal wisely with them. That's a quote that we have in chapter 1 of Exodus and is in our Haggadah. So hava means let's do something bad. That was true until the modern state of Israel. Now in modern Hebrew we say, hava nagila. It's in a positive sense. So we don't use it. We don't use it in that biblical negative sense anymore. And now it says, it can be in a positive sense. So the Rabbeinu Bechaye is saying the words itself tell us what they were doing was bad, and he feels what that was doing that was bad was the gaiva of it, was the haughty arrogance of it, and making themselves into a god. Okay, now I'm at the bold sentence in Rabbeinu Bechaye on the second page. The Torah has worded its report of our story of the tower in such a way that it did not spell out these people evil intent in detail. The Torah purposefully didn't tell us exactly what their sin was. Now, I'm going to say something that the Rabbeinu Bechaye didn't, but I think it's true. I think the Torah is oblique in certain places because there are certain stories that the Torah wants every generation to unravel and interpret for itself. When rabbis, even rabbis from the Talmud, when they gave a sermon, a drashah, they weren't necessarily talking about what happened at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. They were talking to their audience and saying what they felt their audience needed to hear. So sometimes they would give a drashah that wasn't pshat, wasn't the literal meaning of the material. Sometimes they were saying what they felt their audience needed to hear. So that the Torah, I think Rabbeinu Bechai is saying the Torah here is on purpose a little obscure so that different generations can look at their issues with government and with their nationality and their present political situation and take the story of the Tower of Babel and see messages and ideas in it for them. So I think he's saying that it doesn't spell it out because each generation has got to find their own interpretation. And now he gives a totally different interpretation that's Kabbalistic, that I don't totally understand. I've told you before, I love Kabbalistic ideas, but I don't always understand them. I'm definitely not a Kabbalist. And he finishes with this, and we'll do this relatively quickly before we see Rabbi Sachs. Okay. A Kabbalistic approach to the words, let us make a name for ourselves. Again, he's focusing on the sin had to do with the fame, gaiva situation in the story. Fundamentally, their sin was the same as that of their forefather Adam, who had become guilty of what our sages called katzatz binitiyot, cutting off of the plantlings. Now, this expression, which appears in many Kabbalistic texts, seems to mean that there are some actions which prevent us from remaining in contact with Hashem and heaven. And that's called katzatz. We have made a clean break in such a way that we can no longer directly communicate with heaven. In Kabbalah, quite often, we view heaven as an upside down tree. That down here, trees grow with the roots in the ground and the tree trunk and the foliage and the fruit up above it, right? That quite often Kabbalists view heaven as the roots are above in heaven, and it's the trunk and the foliage and the fruit that's down below facing us. And if you do things to break our connection to Hashem and to heaven, you are katzet et hanitiyot. You are severing the roots. And then the tree of spirituality, which is descending towards us, will indeed be lost. And we will lose all of that spiritual power that we're supposed to be getting from heaven. So that's the expression for cutting us off from our spiritual roots, nitiyot, and making us bereft of our communication and connection to God. Okay, so he's saying Adam Rishon did the same thing. First, primordial Adam did the same thing. He cut off his connection to God by trying to become a God himself and ignoring God's command. And so did Enosh. The heresy practiced by Enosh, who invented idolatry by mistake, but he invented idolatry. He said it's too hard for most people to daven directly to God. So God made the stars. So let's worship the stars. And through worshiping the stars, it'll mean that we worship that being God who created the stars. Okay, and that was the beginning, according to the Midrash, of idolatry, and the Rambam brings that down in the laws of idolatry as well. Chapter 1, halacha 1. But the word huchal, which we translate as began, back in sentence verse 6, that they began to do something. But the word can mean from whole. The verse needs to be translated as they did desecration. It wasn't that they began doing something, they desecrated what it was that they were doing. It was a chilul. It was a desecration. These people undertook something which, if left unchecked, would result in the end of mankind. If the humans stayed together and all they were concerned about was building this tower and trying to usurp the influence of Hashem on this world, they would have been destroyed. They would have killed themselves, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have wiped out the remainder. There would have been nothing left. HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to, in this interpretation, had to disperse them so that they would build individually rather than together, so that we would have an end to their attempts for humanity to rule this world without connection to God. This is the deeper meaning of the expression, katzatz b'netiyot, cut off the saplings at their very roots. All of this is part of the hints in the Torah concerning the sins of that generation. May the Lord protect us from committing similar errors. And there's two parts to the error. Number one is ga'ava, is tremendous haughtiness, tremendous vanity. That's number one. And number two, the sense that we can do it alone without communication with Hashem. That those two parts, which are two sides of the same coin, because, we'll see what Rabbi Sachs says. He's going to say something that's going to interpret this a little bit better in just a minute. But this concept is very, very dangerous. That people that think that, kol yachol, people are totally, omnipotent and can do anything they want. Many of the problems that are going on in our world today, in terms of pollution and just the way the world, is going in so many negative ways, is based upon the fact that humans think, we have all the answers, and that kind of thinking just leads to tremendous danger. And Rabbeinu Bechaya therefore ends with a prayer that humanity be saved from that kind of horrible, erroneous thinking. Okay, Rabbi Sachs, Oliver Shalom. When human beings try to become more than human, let's make a name for ourselves. Let's go all the way up to heaven. When people try to be more than humans, don't accept their mortality, don't accept their limitations, they quickly become less than human. When you think you're more than a human being, the result is you are less than a human being. As Lord Acton pointed out, yes, a 19th century British philosopher, but okay, as Lord Acton pointed out, even the great city-state of Athens, which produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, self-destructed when, quote, the possession of unlimited power, which corrodes the conscience, hardens the heart, and confounds the understanding of monarchs, exercised its demoralizing influence. And the oligarchs, the powerful individuals of Athens, just felt this sense of, we know better. We have all the answers. And that kind of hubris is just a horrible position for humanity to take. What went wrong in Athens, he writes, was the belief that there is no law superior to that of the state. By the way, this is going back as well to Professor Rosenberg with communism, which felt the same way. The lawgiver is above the law. What a terrible idea. Whether we're talking about a member of parliament in London, or a member of Congress in Washington, or a member of the Knesset here in Yerushalayim, Era Kodesh, the concept that a human being can be above the law is ridiculous. Moshe Rabbeinu was very clear to say that he wasn't above the law. So how can some puny legislator think that they are above the law? And I underline the following sentence from Rav Sachs because I loved it so much. Only when God is God can man be man. Humanity has to let Hashem in so that Hashem can really be, Melech HaKol Haaretz, and then humans can be humanity and can flourish and survive and do what we're supposed to do within this realm. That means keeping heaven and earth distinct. Kodesh and Chol, Hamavdu ben Kodesh l'Chol. I mean, the whole concept in Judaism is we make distinctions. We make separations. The world can't exist homogenized. There are certain realms where the rules are different than in other realms. And we just have to recognize that all the time. That's true in the physical universe. You can't try to live in outer space like we live down here, but it's true in our religious lives. You don't behave on Shabbos like you do on Tuesday. And that's the way it's supposed to be. That means keeping heaven and earth distinct, organizing the latter under the conscious sovereignty of the former. That we have to make sure that the earth is functioning in a way that it can have communication with heaven. Without this, there is little to prevent human beings from sacrificing the many for the sake of the few, or the few for the sake of the many. That there are different types of tyrannies that can happen, and all of them are terrible. All of them have to allow for individuality and for everybody to find their own expression of self and of fulfillment and of sanctity. Babel was the first civilization, but sadly not the last, to begin with a dream of utopia and end in a nightmare of hell. It's a fascinating phenomenon that almost any movie or book that wants to describe a utopia always ends up with a dystopia. The idea of some humans actually producing perfection is just not true. I mean, we can in a limited sense, you can make a poem that's perfect or a picture that's perfect. But the idea of making the world perfect in your image, it just doesn't work that way. Because we have to understand that there's only one perfection, bigadol, in the big scheme of things, and that's Hashem. And that we, by our nature, even though we might on occasion produce something perfect, it could happen, but we are not perfect. And that distinction must always be understood and kept as a holy idea in our lives. Humanity requires humility to really achieve greatness. And that, according to most of these later authorities, was the tremendous sin of the Tower of Babel. Whenever humanity thinks, and I don't care whether it's a few individuals or an entire society or a government, thinks Kol Yechol, I am omnipotent. That's the beginning of the end. Anybody who says, I can't apologize, I never make mistakes, I never lie, they may be fooling themselves, but the rest of us have to reject such demagogues. It's a very, very dangerous situation. Okay, I have 10 minutes left. I just want to share one more idea before we end, and I want to do this very quickly. The Slonim Arav, who died in 2001, the Nativot Shalom, Shalom Ber Brzezowski, asked the question, well, why do we have, from after Bria and the creation of Adam and Chava, why do we have these other stories? Why can't we just jump to Avram Avinu? Why do we have to have the story of Cain and Hevel, and the story of the flood, and the story of the Tower of Babel? Well, what do we need these for? And he makes a very important idea. He says before you can have good, you have to get rid of bad. We all know the pasuk. First it's Sor Me'ra, depart from the bad, and then Oseh Tov, then Sor Me'ra v'aseh Tov, and afterwards you can do good. You have to get rid of the evil. So you have to recognize the evil and the mistakes and the problems. So that's how Torah was written. We began with seeing 3 specific examples of pure evil, representing 3 mindsets. And we had to see those and then depart from them. And the 3 are the sin of Hevel, the sin of the door, the generation of Noah, and the sin of the generation of the Tower of Babel. And the first sin was Kina, was jealousy. Cain was jealous. Cain was jealous of Hevel because Hevel had his sacrifices accepted by God. The next is ta'ava, desire. So first is jealousy. Then there is desire, appetite, lust. And that was the generation of the flood that, I just want what you have. And and I'm going to, take your wife and take your children and take everything that's yours, stealing and promiscuity. And the last one is the sin of ga'ava, of haughtiness, and vanity. Phil, I'm going to call you back in a couple of minutes, okay? I'm sorry? You didn't get Noah. Oh, I thought I sent. I will send it to you momentarily. Okay, sorry. Okay, bye-bye. I apologize. That's my editor. Phil Chinovsky, who used to do Torah Tidbits, wonderful fellow. Okay, I apologize. So what happens is, so you've got the sin of Kina, then Ta'ava, and then Ga'ava. And those 3 sins of jealousy, lust, and vanity were the hallmarks of those 3 epics. And along come Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and they are the tikkun, the chesed, the kindness of Abraham, the generosity of Abraham is the antidote to Kina. The gvura, the tremendous self-control of Yitzchak, is the antidote to ta'ava, to lust. And Torah study, seeing the vastness of the knowledge of Hashem, Torah is Yaakov Avinu, and that is the antidote to Ga'ava. So that what happens is we need these stories so that we can see the role of the Avot in Olam Hazeh, in this world, and that we can emulate it. That the Avot are the antidote to the sins that precede them, and hopefully we learn those lessons, and that we can hopefully keep the world on its proper path and course throughout world history. That it's the role of the Jew, the Taken Olam, b'Malchut Shaddai, to repair the world under the kingdom of Hashem, of the Almighty. And so we see how these stories led up to the necessity of the Avot coming and becoming the Tikkun and giving the world the izun, the balance needed to be a productive, wonderful place for humanity to live and grow and succeed in. So these stories are not totally extraneous. They are getting us ready for the stories of the Avot, which we begin next week with the stories of Avram Avinu, the first of our patriarchs. Okay, first of all, it's so nice to get back and see everybody. So hi to everybody. And I want to, again, make the request or the announcement I made last year. If there are any topics, I have to apologize. I'm not so good if you're going to pick something truly heavily Kabbalistic, but if it's Kabbalah light, I can handle it. But if there are any topics of a halachic or philosophic nature that you'd like covered in these classes, please let me know, on through WhatsApp, or you can let Gail know too. We sometimes discuss things about the class as well. And again, I have to thank Gail for not only being wonderful family, but for helping to organize everything. And it's just so nice to see everybody and to feel that some normalcy is returning. Okay, thank you. And again, thank you all so much for joining this evening. And thank you. There's my email address for everybody. By the way, if people want to just send me their email address, I was just on the phone with Phil. I do write a Devat Torah every week that I can send out. They're different from what we talk about in the class. So if anybody wants to get them, they're also on the Times of Israel blog, if you look there. But if anyone would like to receive them in the email, please let me know, and I will send them. So again, what?
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank
Nice
you.
to have you back.
Oh, nice to have you guys back too. It's wonderful to see you this way. But I hope that before too long we'll find the time, Rivka and I, to come down and visit again in Ashkelon, so that we can do a live one. But again, so good to see everybody. It should be a great beginning of a new cycle of learning together. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Laila
you.
Tov.
Perfect shiur for these times.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay.
Tודה רבה.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.